The nightmare always started the same way. Sand. Heat. The sound of a boy screaming in a language Elias Vance no longer needed to understand. He woke at 3:47 a.m. He knew without checking, because he always woke at 3:47 a.m. with his hand clamped around the hunting knife on the nightstand and his heart hammering like it was trying to punch through his sternum. The ceiling of the farmhouse stared back at him, water-stained and cracked, a map of nowhere. Outside, the pines were buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Blackwood, Vermont. Population 340 if you counted the Henderson's goats. Elias had chosen it precisely because nobody here knew what a seal was and nobody cared. He lay there in the dark, breathing deliberately. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. The shrink at the VA had called it box breathing. Elias called it not losing his mind in a rented farmhouse at 4 in the morning, but the technique was the same either way. Then Titan growled. Not the low conversational rumble the Belgian Malinois made when a deer wandered too close to the tree line. This was something older. Something that came from deep in the dog's chest, a sound that bypassed the ears entirely and landed directly in the spine. Elias was out of bed before his conscious mind had finished processing it. Titan was at the basement door. The dog stood rigid, every muscle in his 85-pound frame locked the fur along his spine, standing in a perfect ridge from neck to tail. His amber eyes were fixed on the basement door, with the kind of focus Elias had only seen him deploy downrange when the target was real and the threat was confirmed. Titan, sit rep. The dog didn't look at him. He pawed at the door. Once, twice, then he started scraping his nails, dragging down the old wood, and Elias saw the pads of his front feet were already raw from doing this. Not just tonight. This had been going on for days, weeks maybe, and Elias had written it off as rodents in the walls. He should have listened sooner. He knew that now. He grabbed the maglite from the kitchen drawer, racked the slide on his Glock out of pure muscle memory, and opened the basement door. The cold hit him first. The farmhouse basement was always cold fieldstone walls, a dirt floor that never fully dried, but this was different. This was the cold of something sealed, something that hadn't breathed in a long time. The maglite beam cut through the dark and caught nothing but the usual clutter: cardboard boxes, a broken chest freezer, his grandfather's fishing rods still in their canvas sleeves. Titan blew past him down the stairs, nose already working. He went directly to the north wall. The old one, the original fieldstone foundation that predated the rest of the house by 30 years. He planted his front paws against the mortar and started barking 3 sharp, declarative barks, the alert he'd been trained to give when he found a find. Then he scratched at the wall. The mortar crumbled like wet chalk. Elias crossed the basement and ran his fingers along the seam where a section of old brick had been set into the fieldstone newer construction by maybe 40 or 50 years, fitted in with care by someone who'd wanted it to look like it had always been there. The brickwork was good, but it wasn't perfect. One corner of the section was slightly proud of the surrounding stone, barely a 1/4 inch, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were standing close with a flashlight, and a dog who wouldn't stop barking. He went back upstairs for the sledgehammer. 3 swings. The third one punched through, and the bricks fell inward into a hollow space behind the wall, and the smell that came out was the smell of sealed time old paper machine oil and something metallic and faintly sweet that Elias recognized from evidence bags in forward operating bases. Classified material, the chemical treatment used on documents that weren't supposed to exist. He widened the hole with 2 more swings, then reached in. The box was steel about the size of a shoebox, with a combination lock that had seized solid with rust. He set it on the floor, wedged the sledgehammer's claw under the lid, and popped it. Inside, a manila envelope thick with photographs. A micro-cassette recorder in a Ziploc bag. A ledger spiral-bound, its pages swollen with moisture, but still legible. And a single photograph paper-clipped to the top of the pile of a man Elias recognized immediately. His father. Standing in front of this farmhouse, shaking hands with a man in a suit. Elias stared at it for a long time. His father had died in this house. Stroke, the coroner had said. Stress-induced cardiac event in a man who'd spent 22 years carrying the weight of 2 combat tours and a foreclosure notice. They'd sold the farm to cover the debts. Elias had bought it back 4 years later out of something he couldn't name, stubbornness maybe, or guilt, or the particular need combat veterans have to reclaim the ground they've lost. He picked up the maglite to look at the photograph more closely, and the beam swung across the far interior of the cavity behind the wall. That's when he saw it. Small, black, mounted in the upper corner of the hollow space angled downward toward the basement floor. A camera no larger than a pack of cigarettes, its housing thick with dust. Old tech, but not that old. And on its face a single LED indicator cycling through its slow pulse. Red, dark, still active, still transmitting. Somewhere, someone had been watching this basement for years, and now they knew Elias had found the box. Titan pressed against his leg, silent now, his amber eyes fixed on the camera's blinking light, with an expression that on a human face would have been called dread. Elias didn't touch the camera. That was the first rule they drilled into you in SEAL training, long before the weapons qualifications and the dive certifications. Never let the enemy know what you know. The moment you react, you've given up your position. So he held the maglite steady, let the beam drift casually past the device like he hadn't seen it, and walked back to the box. He tucked it under his arm, called Titan, with a soft click of his tongue, and climbed the stairs. His hands were completely still. That's how he knew he was scared. He set the box on the kitchen table and went through the contents methodically, the way he'd been trained to process intelligence in the field photograph. Everything disturb, nothing build the picture before you start drawing conclusions. The micro-cassette recorder still worked. He found an adapter in a junk drawer, plugged it into his laptop, and hit play. The voice on the tape was immediately recognizable to anyone in Blackwood County. Deep, deliberate, the careful diction of a man who'd spent 30 years making sure every word he said sounded reasonable. Mayor Gerald Harlow. The recording was a conversation, 2 men, Harlow, and someone he called the attorney, discussing property assessments, banknotes, and something they kept referring to as the acceleration program. It took Elias 4 minutes of listening before he understood what the acceleration program was. They were manufacturing reasons to foreclose on veterans' properties. Falsified tax liens, backdated code violations. Pressure applied through a compliant sheriff's department to men who were already drowning, men with PTSD, men with addiction issues, men who'd come home from Fallujah and Kandahar to find that the paperwork of civilian life was somehow harder to survive than a firefight. Harlow's people would create the crisis, then swoop in through shell companies to acquire the land at pennies on the dollar. His father's name appeared in the ledger on page 11. 47 acres. Acquisition price $31,000. Current assessed value $890,000. Elias sat back in his chair. The farmhouse felt different now. Not like home. Like a crime scene. He thought about his father's hands, thick, rope-scarred hands that had rebuilt this barn twice and never once asked anyone for help. And then he stopped thinking about it, because that particular road had no good ending at 4 a.m. with a loaded Glock on the table. He needed to move. Get the box to his truck, get to the state police barracks in Montfield before Harlow's people realized what he'd found. The camera feed would have already triggered something somewhere. He had maybe an hour, probably less. He loaded the ledger, the recorder, and the photographs into a waterproof dry bag from his go kit. He pulled on his boots and his field jacket. He looked at Titan. "You ready to work?" The dog was already at the door. He was 3 steps from the truck when Titan stopped. Not the gradual deceleration of a dog picking up an interesting scent. A full, instantaneous stop, all 4 legs braced, hackles up, head angled toward the basement window. The low growl again, that spinal sound, and then Titan turned and pushed back against Elias's legs, physically driving him away from the truck. Elias trusted that more than his own instincts. He stepped back. Then he smelled the gasoline. It came from beneath him, seeping up through the kitchen floorboards. Someone had gone around the back of the house while Elias was at the table while he was listening to the tape and reading the ledger, and had been very quiet about it. The basement windows. 3 of them low to the ground, easy to crack open, easy to pour through. The first flame caught with a sound like a held breath finally released. Elias grabbed Titan's harness and ran for the basement door, the same door he'd come down through 20 minutes ago, and found it chained from the outside. The chain rattled against the bracket solid and new. Someone had come prepared. The smoke reached the kitchen in under a minute. Real fire moved faster than people expected. Elias knew this. He knew it the way he knew everything that could kill him, not as an abstraction, but as a weight, a clock, a shrinking set of options. He went for the eastern wall, the oldest section of the farmhouse, where the original construction used gaps between the fieldstone for ventilation. He pulled the chest freezer aside, found a seam in the stonework low to the ground, and started working it with the sledgehammer he'd left down here. Above him, the floor joists were beginning to go. He could hear them, the deep ticking of wood, expanding too fast, the structural language of a building that was running out of time. Titan was at his side, not panicking, watching the ceiling with those precise amber eyes, tracking it the way he'd been trained to track threats. The eastern wall gave on the third strike. Cold night air poured in. Elias turned to call Titan through, and the ceiling cracked open directly above them. Titan didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, all 85 pounds of him, and drove his shoulder into Elias's ribcage, slamming them both into the far corner of the basement, as the burning roof beam came down and split the floor where they'd been standing into smoking rubble. The impact drove the air from Elias's lungs. He lay in the corner with the dog on top of him, ears ringing, the heat enormous, and through the hole in the eastern wall, the Vermont night waited black and freezing and completely indifferent. They had maybe 90 seconds before the rest of the ceiling followed. They came out of the woods looking like survivors of something that hadn't finished killing them yet. Elias had the dry bag strapped across his chest, the evidence still inside, still intact. Titan moved beside him on 3 legs, favoring the left front where a falling timber had caught him across the shoulder. The dog didn't make a sound about it. He never did. That was the thing about Malinois. They had a higher pain threshold than most humans, and considerably more dignity about it. The farmhouse behind them was fully involved now, orange light bleeding up through the tree line, black smoke climbing into the pre-dawn sky. Someone would call it in. In Blackwood County, that meant Sheriff Dale Pruitt's department would be first on scene. Elias had read Pruitt's name in the ledger, page 19. A number with 5 zeros behind it, paid out over 3 years in increments small enough to avoid federal reporting thresholds. He knew what was coming. He moved anyway, because the only alternative was to stop. They were 200 yards from the county road when the lights hit them. 3 vehicles positioned to cut off the tree line. Doors opening. The crunch of boots on frozen ground. Elias Vance. Pruitt's voice, amplified through a handheld bullhorn, bounced off the pines with that particular bureaucratic flatness of a man who'd rehearsed this. Set down the bag and put your hands where we can see them. Elias calculated the geometry of the situation in about 3 seconds and didn't like any of it. He set the bag down, slowly straightened up, and raised his hands. They cuffed him without ceremony. One of the deputies, young, avoiding eye contact, took the dry bag and handed it directly to a man in a civilian coat standing beside Pruitt's cruiser. Not a deputy, not anybody official, just a man in a coat who received classified evidence like it was a grocery delivery and walked it to a waiting SUV. Titan growled at the man in the coat and was answered with a prod from a catchpole. Don't. Elias said it quietly to the dog, not the deputy. Titan went still, but his eyes tracked the man in the coat all the way to the SUV. The charge was arson. Self-inflicted property damage for insurance fraud, Pruitt explained in the booking room, with the particular satisfaction of a man reading from a script he'd been handed by someone smarter than him. They'd already called the insurance company. They had a witness, a neighbor conveniently, who'd seen Elias carrying accelerant toward the house at midnight. There was no neighbor within a mile of the farmhouse. Elias said nothing. He sat in the chair, wrists cuffed to the table ring, and let Pruitt talk. The cell they put him in was 8 by 10 concrete block walls, a cot bolted to the floor, a single bare bulb behind a wire cage. The heat register was broken. The cold came up through the floor, the way cold always did in old Vermont buildings, slowly with patience, as if it had all the time in the world. He sat on the cot and listened. Down the corridor, through 2 sets of doors, he could hear it tighten. Not barking. A sound worse than barking. The low, exhausted vocalization of an animal in serious pain, the kind of sound a dog makes when it has stopped expecting help and is simply reporting its condition to the world. Elias pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The PTSD didn't announce itself. It never did. One moment he was in a county jail in Vermont, and the next he was somewhere else entirely. The specific weight of a bad night, the smell of smoke that his nervous system had now permanently cross-indexed with catastrophic loss. His hands started shaking. He locked them together between his knees and focused on the concrete floor until the floor was the only thing that existed. He was still staring at it when the corridor door opened. The footsteps were unhurried. Custom shoes on concrete, the sound of a man who'd never had to hurry for anything in his life. Elias looked up. Gerald Harlow was 63 years old and looked like a man who'd been designed by committee to appear trustworthy, silver hair, a jawline that photographed well the kind of year-round tan that came from golf rather than weather. He stopped in front of the cell, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked at Elias the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved. He reached into his coat pocket and held something up between 2 fingers. A collar. Nylon webbing, forest green, the quick-release buckle that Elias had custom-fitted to Titan's neck 2 years ago. There was a dark stain across the length of it. Harlow let it fall. It hit the concrete floor with a sound smaller than it should have made. Animal control determined he was too compromised to rehabilitate, Harlow said. His voice was the same voice from the tape, reasonable, deliberate, designed to sound like the last word on any subject. Humane decision. I want you to know it was handled professionally. He straightened his cuffs. You're next on the docket, Mr. Vance. Get some rest. The footsteps retreated. The corridor door closed. Elias looked at the collar on the floor for a long time. Then he picked it up, held it in both hands, and for the first time since Kandahar, he wept not quietly, not with any dignity at all, but with the full, ugly, uncontrolled grief of a man who has nothing left to lose. Grief has a shelf life in combat veterans. Not because they feel it less, because they've learned through repetition that feeling it too long gets you killed. Elias sat with the collar in his hands for exactly 4 minutes. Then he put it in his jacket pocket, stood up, and started looking at the cell the way he should have been looking at it from the moment they locked the door. The bunk was bolted to the wall with 4 half-inch hex bolts, institutional grade, but the mounting plate on the near side had worked loose over years of use. He could see the gap where the bracket had pulled slightly away from the block. The wire cage over the light bulb was spot-welded, not screwed. The door hinges were interior-mounted, which was standard, but the door itself was hollow-core steel, the cheaper county procurement variety, and hollow-core steel flexed under lateral stress in ways that solid plate did not. He'd been in worse positions. Twice with actual hostile government forces involved, once in a basement in Mosul that made this cell look like a hotel room. He listened to the building. 2 deputies on this corridor, he'd counted footsteps during the booking process. Shift change at 6 a.m., which was 40 minutes out. The officer currently closest to his cell had walked past twice in the last hour, with the slightly uneven gait of a man wearing new boots that hadn't broken in yet. New boots meant a newer hire. Newer hires checked their phones more than they checked their prisoners. Elias used the loose mounting plate. It took 8 minutes of careful, quiet work to free it from the wall without making noise. The bracket was 6 inches of solid steel with a squared edge. He used it on the door lock mechanism the way a trauma surgeon uses a retractor, not force precision, working the latch until the bolt disengaged from the strike plate, with a sound no louder than a knuckle pop. The corridor was empty. He took the nearest deputy's rain jacket from the hook by the side exit, went out through the parking lot, and moved into the tree line before the first patrol vehicle completed its perimeter loop. The temperature was 11 degrees. The snow was coming down in the particular heavy, silent way that Vermont snow came down when it meant business. He ran anyway. The Blackwood Animal Control Facility was a converted auto shop on Route 93, miles from the sheriff's station, the kind of local government repurposing that looked fine on a budget spreadsheet and less fine in person. One external camera over the front entrance aimed at the parking lot. A side door with a push-bar exit that by fire code could not be locked from the outside. Elias went in through the side. The interior smelled of antiseptic and wet concrete and the particular anxious energy of animals in unfamiliar spaces. He moved past the kennel runs, dogs lifting their heads as he passed, none of them barking as if they recognized something in the way he moved until he found the rear room marked medical in faded stencil above the door. Titan was on a stainless steel table. An IV line ran to his left foreleg. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, but present, and the burn damage to his right shoulder and flank had been treated with a field dressing that told Elias the vet tech who'd applied it had done their best with limited supplies. The too compromised to rehabilitate determination existed on paperwork somewhere. In this room, the dog was simply still alive. Elias put his hand on Titan's ribcage and felt it rise and fall. He stood there for a moment that had no tactical value whatsoever and didn't care. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, let's go." Titan's eyes opened. Not with the dramatic alertness of a movie dog, with the slow assessing focus of an animal that had cataloged the situation while unconscious and was now confirming that the most important variable in the room was the right one. He found Elias's face. His tail moved once against the table, a single controlled acknowledgement. Elias disconnected the IV, carefully secured the dressing, and lifted the dog off the table with both arms. Titan was dead weight. The shoulder injury made him non-ambulatory, and Elias felt the extent of it in the way the dog held himself, compensating, redistributing. He'd carried heavier things under worse conditions. The alarm tripped when they were 40 yards from the building. Someone had put a secondary sensor on the medical room door, motion-activated wireless, the kind of addition you made when you were specifically worried about someone coming back for the dog. Harlow had thought of everything. Blue and red light strobed through the trees from the direction of Route 9, response time under 3 minutes, which meant they'd been close, which meant this had been anticipated. Elias pulled Titan tighter against his chest and went deeper into the woods, moving on instinct and muscle memory through the dark. The trees thinned at the ridge above Miller's Gulch. Elias came through the last of the pines and stopped. Below him, the road curved in a horseshoe, and on every arc of that curve, vehicles had positioned themselves with their lights aimed inward. A dozen officers minimum. The laser sights came up simultaneously, red lines traveling through the falling snow until they found his chest. Behind him, more boots on frozen ground. Closing. He was standing at the edge of a 30-foot drop into the gulch, with a wounded dog in his arms, and every direction that wasn't straight down was covered. Word count 893. Tôi đã viết xong, bạn có muốn viết tiếp? You said bạn hãy tiếp tục viết chương tiếp theo, dựa trực tiếp trên dàn ý đã xây dựng để xuyên suốt câu chuyện từ chương 1 đến chương này. Bạn hãy tiếp tục viết chương tiếp theo dựa trực tiếp trên dàn ý đã xây dựng để xuyên suốt câu chuyện từ chương 1 đến chương này. Yêu cầu 1. Mỗi chương dưới 900 từ viết xong một chương thì dừng lại để tôi phản hồi trước khi tiếp tục. 2. Từ chương 1 đến chương 6 phải logic xuyên suốt không rời mạch. 3. Ngôn ngữ viết bằng tiếng Anh bản địa Mỹ 5. Nội dung phải nâng cấp hoặc đảo chiều cảm xúc so với chương trước, giữ đúng nhịp đường cong cảm xúc. 6. Nội dung tuyệt đối tuân thủ chính sách YouTube. 7. Khi kết thúc mỗi chương hãy báo lại số tư để tôi kiểm tra. 8. Không sử dụng những câu rắp khuôn của AI. Mục tiêu mũi tên biên dàn ý 6 chương thành một câu chuyện hoàn chỉnh logic và cuốn hút từ đầu đến cuối. 0856, Claude responded, Chapter 5. The Shot Heard Across America. Chapter 5. The Shot Heard Across America. Elias had one asset they didn't know about. 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday afternoon, with nothing particular to do, he'd taken the evidence from the steel box. All of it photographed every page of the ledger, duplicated the cassette audio to digital files, and uploaded the entire package to an encrypted cloud drive. Not because he'd expected this. Because 15 years of operating in environments where everything could go wrong at once had made contingency planning as automatic as breathing. The cloud drive was linked to a satellite communicator clipped inside the waistband of his jacket. Older unit military, surplus, the kind that didn't need cell towers, the kind that worked in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, which meant it worked fine in Vermont. He set Titan down carefully in the snow behind a boulder at the ridge edge out of the sight lines from below. The dog pressed against his leg and stayed still. Elias pulled out the communicator and opened the app. The stream went live at 5:47 a.m. He didn't do a preamble. He didn't explain himself. He simply turned the camera outward toward the road below, where the vehicles were arranged in their horseshoe and the laser sights painted red lines through the falling snow, and he started talking. His voice was flat and operational and completely steady, the voice of a man reading a grid coordinate into a radio, not the voice of a man standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go. My name is Elias Vance. I'm a retired Navy SEAL. I'm standing above Miller's Gulch in Blackwood County, Vermont, and the people trying to take me into custody right now work for a man named Gerald Harlow, who has spent the last decade stealing land from veterans. I have the documentation. It's all in the link in my profile. Every page, every recording, every number. He paused. I'm uploading it now. He hit send on the cloud drive. The upload bar moved across the screen. Behind him, the boots in the woods had stopped moving. They could hear him talking, and whoever was running the operation on the other end of Pruitt's radio was processing the new information. The stream counter climbed 400 viewers, 2,000, 11,000. The internet moved fast when the algorithm caught something real. A veteran in the snow with laser sights on his chest was real. The documents appearing in the linked drive were real people, were already downloading screenshot, and posting to every platform that existed. By 6,000 viewers, someone in the comments had already identified Harlow by name from the ledger photographs. By 15,000, a retired JAG officer in Alexandria had posted a thread analyzing the recordings and used the words RICO statute and federal conspiracy charges. Below the ridge, Pruitt's voice came through the bullhorn. Mr. Vance, put down the device and step away from the edge. Elias kept the camera running. I have a dog up here named Titan, he said. He's a decorated military working dog. He found this evidence. He's the reason any of this exists. I need people to know that. He turned the camera briefly to Titan. The dog was sitting in the snow, ears up, watching the tree line with professional attention, despite the shoulder injury, despite everything. Doing his job. The comment section broke open. 30,000 viewers. 40. The numbers were moving too fast to read. Harlow appeared at the road below. Elias saw him before the camera caught him, the silver hair, the civilian coat. The walk of a man who'd decided that the situation required his personal management. He came up the access trail with 2 men behind him, bypassing Pruitt's line, moving with the focused urgency of someone who understood that every additional second of live stream was a year added to a federal sentence. Elias tracked him on camera. There he is, he said to the 100,000 people now watching. Gerald Harlow, mayor of Blackwood County for 18 years. Harlow stopped 20 feet away. His face had shed the reasonable deliberateness. Underneath it was something older and less managed. Turn it off, he said. No. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing. The 2 men behind Harlow spread slightly, and Elias shifted the camera back to himself so the stream showed his face and Harlow's position simultaneously. He'd done enough surveillance work to know how angles told stories. 214 veterans, Elias said to the camera to the country that was now watching. That's how many families are in that ledger. My father is one of them. He died thinking he'd failed. He didn't fail, he was robbed. Harlow's hand moved. Everything happened in the compressed, frameless time that combat operated in. The draw, the report. A single sharp crack that the snow swallowed almost instantly, and Elias felt the air move past his left ear close enough that he felt it rather than heard it. Then 70 pounds of wounded Belgian Malinois left the ground. Titan had been sitting 6 feet to Elias's right. In the fractional second between the sound and the impact, the dog crossed that distance and went airborne, driving into Harlow's arm, taking the second shot into his own flank, as the camera, still live, still streaming, caught every frame of it to an audience that had just crossed 500,000 viewers and was still climbing. The dog and the man went down together in the snow. Titan did not get up. The FBI's Critical Incident Response Group out of Albany made it to Miller's Gulch in 41 minutes. Elias knew the exact time because he'd been kneeling in the snow next to Titan for every one of those minutes, his hand pressed flat against the dog's ribcage, counting breaths. Not praying exactly, something older than prayer. The specific wordless negotiation that soldiers made with outcomes they couldn't control. Titan's breathing was shallow, but it was there. Uneven, working too hard, but there. The stream was still live when the first FBI helicopter came over the tree line. Elias had propped the communicator against a rock and left it running, and by the time the rotors drowned out everything else, the viewer count had passed 2 million and was moving in increments too large to track. Someone in the comments, a retired Army nurse, her profile said, was posting real-time guidance on how to apply pressure to a dog's flank wound. Elias followed her instructions without question. Harlow was in flex cuffs on the ground, 15 feet away, 2 agents standing over him, when he finally stopped being reasonable and started screaming about his attorney. It was, Elias thought, the first completely honest thing he'd ever heard the man say. Pruitt surrendered his badge and his sidearm without being asked. He sat in the snow with his hands on his knees and looked at the ground like a man reviewing a long series of decisions he'd made for what had seemed like good reasons at the time. An agent in a tactical vest crouched next to Elias. Young, mid-30s, the flat professional affect of someone who'd seen bad situations and learned to process them efficiently. She looked at Titan, then at Elias. "We have a vet unit out of Burlington on the second bird," she said. 8 minutes. "He's got 6, Elias said. "I know." She put her hand on Elias's shoulder briefly, the way people did when there was nothing useful left to say. "Keep doing what you're doing." The veterinary team landed in 7 minutes. They worked on Titan in the snow, while the FBI processed the scene around them, and Elias stayed exactly where he was, out of their way, but close enough to maintain contact, one hand resting lightly on the dog's head below the reach of the medical equipment, so Titan would know the most important variable in the room was still the right one. They airlifted him to the University of Vermont Large Animal and Specialty Hospital in Burlington. The surgical team that took the case had a combined 60 years of trauma experience between them and gave Titan a 1% chance of surviving the next 4 hours. They said it factually, not cruelly, because that was the number and Elias had specifically asked for the number. He sat in the waiting room in a borrowed FBI field jacket, still wearing the remnants of clothes that had been through a house fire and a snowstorm and a night in a county jail, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, he had nothing left to do. No next move, no contingency to execute. He sat with that for a while. It felt strange. It felt distantly like something approaching peace. The country, in the meantime, was having a moment. The stream footage ran on every network by 8 a.m. The clip of Titan intercepting Harlow's second shot, 70 pounds of wounded dog leaving the ground in the clean, committed arc of an animal that had made a decision without hesitation, was shared 40 million times in 18 hours. Veterans groups, civic organizations, and 2 senators from the Armed Services Committee issued statements before noon. The Department of Justice announced a federal task force by 3 in the afternoon, folding in 18 months of prior investigation that had been stalled at the regional level by exactly the kind of local political pressure that Harlow had specialized in. 214 families in the ledger. Restitution proceedings began within the week. Elias's father's 47 acres were in that ledger. He didn't learn this until later. He didn't have the bandwidth for it in that waiting room in that borrowed jacket, watching the surgical unit door and counting minutes the way he'd once counted breaths in a foreign mountain range with his team spread out in the dark below him. The surgeon came out at 11:22 a.m. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had delivered every possible category of news in this hallway and knew how to carry each kind. She stopped in front of Elias and looked at him directly. Then she nodded. One small, definitive nod. Elias put his face in his hands. The waiting room was full by then veterans who'd driven through the night from 3 states, civilians who'd followed the stream and simply showed up hospital staff who'd cleared their morning schedules for reasons they couldn't entirely articulate. None of them made a sound. They just let him have the moment, every one of them, because they understood what it cost and what it was worth. 7 days later, on a Thursday morning with the sky the particular clear blue that only happened in Vermont after a hard freeze, Titan walked out of the hospital. Not steadily. With a limp that the surgical team said would probably improve and might possibly remain. With a shaved patch on his flank and new suture lines that would become scars. But walking under his own power, head up, the amber eyes moving in their careful professional assessment of the environment, same as always, same as ever. Elias was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Titan came down slowly, 1 step at a time, and walked directly to him the way he'd always walked to him, without drama, without uncertainty, as if there had never been any other destination under consideration. Elias dropped to one knee in the cold and put both arms around the dog and held on. Around them, the crowd that had gathered, hundreds of people, veterans in their old unit hats, families who'd driven from counties whose names Elias didn't know. A small delegation of children holding handmade signs began to applaud. Not the sharp, performative applause of an event, but the slow, sustained kind that started from somewhere genuine and built on itself. Elias didn't hear it for a while. He was somewhere else entirely, back in the basement of a farmhouse, listening to a dog bark at a wall, understanding now what Titan had known before he did, that the truth was in there, that it mattered, that it was worth the cost of finding it. His father had not failed. He had been robbed by men who counted on soldiers being too proud to ask for help and too damaged to fight back. They had miscalculated. Elias stood up slowly. Titan moved to his left side and sat, his shoulder pressing against Elias's leg, with the easy familiarity of 10,000 hours of working together, of sleeping on the same floor, in the same bad places, of a partnership that had been tested in every way a partnership could be tested and had held. The morning light came across the mountains, flat and gold and generous, the way light did when a long night was genuinely over. Elias looked out at the people who'd come, strangers who'd become something harder to name, witnesses to something that had mattered, and felt for the first time in years like the ground beneath his feet was solid. Some wounds closed in operating rooms, some closed in courtrooms, in restitution payments, in federal indictments with 17 counts, and some closed on a cold Thursday morning on a hospital steps in Burlington, Vermont, with a dog leaning against your leg, and the sun finally coming up where you could see it.